The storm didn't knock. It kicked the desert door clean open. Wind howled down the main road of Rio Verde, slamming grit and stinging dust into Clara Whitmore's face as she limped past the shuttered windows of the mercantile. Her shawl, wet and useless, clung to her like second skin. The hem of her skirt was caked with red mud. Every step sent a hot spike of pain through her crooked left leg. She had 37 cents to her name. No room, no food, and no one waiting for her. The wind shoved her sideways, and she caught herself against the post outside the boarded-up saloon. Somewhere behind her, a horse whinnied in panic. Lightning cracked the darkening sky in two, and for a split second, the town glowed ghost-white empty porches, swinging signs, windows nailed shut, like a ghost town that had once made room for hope, but had since evicted it. She pressed a hand to her side and tried to breathe through the pain. Her leg throbbed, not just from walking, but from the look the boarding house keeper had given. Her just 10 minutes ago? You. The woman had scoffed, eyes darting to Clara's limp. I'm not running a charity. Yes, keep moving, girl. Clara had nodded, her jaw clenched tight. Pride kept her upright more than strength now. She kept moving toward the mercantile's porch, drawn by the single lantern still burning. Shelter, even for a few minutes, was worth risking another look of disgust as she reached the steps. The door opened with a sharp creak, and a man stepped out. Tall, broad, a brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his stance was solid, like he belonged to the land in a way she never had anywhere. You best come out of the storm, he said, voice low. No judgment in it, it's just fact. Clara straightened. I'm not begging, just looking for work. The man studied her for a moment. His gaze flicked to her leg, not long, not lingering, just enough. Then his eyes met hers again, calm and unblinking. You cook? Yes, sir. And clean, so read, write. I'll work for board and wages fair to the job. He gave a slow nod. I'm Gideon Hart. Got a ranch a few miles out. We're short. A cook. Lightning split the sky again. Clara flinched but didn't back down. I don't ride well, she said. My leg. I ride well enough for both of us, he said, already turning to tie down the parcels on his saddle. You can decide along the way if you're staying. She hesitated. Pride had kept her from worse fates. But pride wouldn't feed her tomorrow. Clara stepped off the porch. He handed her a gentle-eyed mare, and when she faltered, he lifted her into his saddle as if she weighed nothing. Then he mounted behind her, arms braced around her to take the reins. The moment his hands touched hers, Clara's breath caught, not because he was close, not because he was a man, but because he didn't flinch at her touch like so many others. Had the ride was silent, except for the storm, wind screaming through the cactus fields, rained like pebbles on leather, Gideon's arms held steady, firm around her, guiding the horse with ease. The warmth of him at her back was strange, not unwanted. It made her remember what safety might feel like. She didn't speak, neither did he. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky was breaking open, streaks of soft pink bleeding through the bruised clouds. The house was larger than she expected, 2 stories, wraparound porch, smoke curling from the chimney. It looked like it had been built by someone who meant to stay. A man who didn't scare easy. He helped her down, hands at her waist, lowering her slowly until her boots hit ground. You'll meet Mrs. Talbot inside. She keeps the house. Clara nodded, swallowing hard against the ache in her leg. The ranch wasn't just a place. It was a test. Inside, the warmth hit her like a memory. Wood floors, oil lamp glow, smell of stew and fire. A stout woman in an apron looked up from the kitchen. This the new cook? She asked, eyes sweeping over Clara with a lifetime's worth of judgment packed into a second. Clara stood straight. Yes, ma'am, if you'll have me, Mrs. Talbot grunted. Can you make biscuits that don't kill a man's teeth? I've never buried one yet. The woman smirked. We'll see. She led Clara to a small room off the kitchen narrow bed. One window, clean. It's not much, Mrs. Talbot said. It's more than I had yesterday, Clara answered. By the time she unpacked her small bundle of belongings, a brush, A worn book of Psalms, a sewing needle kit. Clara was shaking. Not from cold. From the weight of relief she wasn't ready to trust. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared out at the horizon. The storm was moving east. The desert looked clean, like it had been scrubbed raw and left new. She wrote in her journal by lamplight, words tight and neat. April 17th, 1874. The Hart Ranch may be the last place left to try. The owner is fair, I think. Silent, but not cruel. I've been given a room a chance. That's more than I dared hope. She closed the book and leaned back on the thin mattress. Somewhere, through the wall, she heard boots on the wooden floor. Heavy, measured. Like someone walking not toward, but through something, maybe, she thought. She'd come to the right place after all. She followed him into the storm, not knowing whether she was walking toward shelter or into another kind of ruin. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and a voice like a whip crack. Up. Now, men eat at dawn whether you're ready or not, barked Mrs. Talbot from behind the thin wooden door. Clara sat up fast, legs stiff from the storm-drenched ride. The little room off the kitchen was still half dark, shadows long against the plank walls. She dressed in silence, brushing her skirt smooth with trembling hands. This wasn't St. Louis. There'd be no second chances here. She limped into the kitchen and found Mrs. Talbot already at the stove, sleeves rolled. Fire roaring. I prepped some last night, the older woman said without turning. You'll do the rest. Bacon, eggs, biscuits, potatoes, coffee's already on. Don't burn the beans. Yes, ma'am, Clara answered, reaching for the flour sack. She liked the kitchen. It was clean, functional, and well-stocked, clearly. The heart of the house? A place of order. Her limp mattered less when everything had its place. She lost herself in the rhythm, peel, slice, stir, roll, bake. Sweat gathered at the base of her neck as the oven heated, but she didn't slow. The pain in her leg dulled into background noise. When the first boot steps hit the porch outside, her hands didn't tremble. Much Mrs. Talbot wiped her hands and called toward the hallway. They're coming. The door swung open in the ranch. Hands filed in, sunburned, half awake, already covered in dust. They muttered greetings as they grabbed coffee and sat down. Then he walked in, not Gideon, though. She half expected him. This man was younger, looser, hair tousled like he'd just rolled out of bed and didn't care. His shirt was half-buttoned, sleeves cuffed carelessly, a scar on his cheek that looked like it had a story. He grinned when he saw her. Well, now, this must be the new cook. I was told you had a limp, but nobody said anything about those eyes. Clara nearly dropped the skillet. I'm Elias, he said, leaning against the counter with a casual charm that set her teeth on edge. Hart, same as the boss. He's my older brother. I'm Clara Whitmore, she said, turning back to her biscuits. Miss Whitmore, he said mock formal. Pleasure's all mine. Gideon entered a moment later. His presence quieted the room without a word. He nodded once toward Clara, then took his seat at the head of the table. She served without flinching, keeping her limp hidden as best she could. Gideon didn't look at her often, but when he did, it wasn't like Ilias's gaze. It was steadier. Notice the biscuits browned just right. The way she cradled her wrist to take weight off her left side. Nothing escaped him, and yet he never said a word. The men ate fast. Gideon stayed behind as the rest headed out, refilled his coffee, then said, almost quietly, that was good. But Clara didn't know how to answer that, so she just nodded. He stood, placed his cup in the wash basin, and left. After the door closed behind him, Elias reappeared as if summoned by silence. Bit quiet, isn't he? He said, watching her scrub dishes. Gideon, he's been like that ever since Ma and Pa passed. Built this whole place up from nothing. Forgot to build a personality along the way. Clara frowned. He's kind. That he is, Elias agreed, then grinned. But kindness ain't the same as warm. She didn't reply. He leaned in, lowered his voice. Let me guess. You think you can fix him? Smooth his edges. Heal his wounds. Clara dried her hands. I'm here to work. That's all. Elias stepped back, hands up. Of course. My mistake. But the look in his eyes said otherwise. Later that afternoon, while baking bread, Clara stepped outside to cool off. The porch gave her a view of the open range, dusty hills, scattered cactus, blue mountains beyond. The air was dry, but clean. Honest, something she hadn't felt in years. That's when she saw the woman. She stood near the edge of the fence. Line, a shawl draped over her dark hair, eyes sharp. She was maybe in her 40s, tall, the grace of someone who'd survived things no one spoke of. Clara walked toward her, careful not to twist her bad leg. Afternoon, she said politely. The woman looked at her, expression unreadable. You're the girl they brought in last night. I'm Clara Whitmore, Marisol Reyes. I live on the next property, West Widow. Clara nodded. It's good to meet you. Marisol's gaze drifted to her leg, then back up. You're staying. Long as they'll have me. Marisol's eyes softened, just a fraction. This land doesn't give things easy. Not to anyone, but especially not to women. I'm not afraid of hard work. Work's not the thing that breaks. People out here... Clara swallowed. What is then? Marisol turned back toward the hills. Hope. She left without another word. That night, Clara sat at her window, the scent of desert dust clinging to her hair. She thought about Marisol's words, about Elias's grin, about Gideon's silence. They were all measuring her in different ways. Not for her limp, not anymore, but for how much she could carry before breaking. That night, Clara understood something clearly. On this land, kindness was rare, and attention was never harmless. The desert didn't just turn, it shifted, like an old dog raising its hackles. It started with the silence. No birds, no bugs, not even the low moan of the wind. It's the kind of quiet that made your skin itch before your brain caught up. Clara stood in the yard, wiping her hands on her apron, and stared west, where the sky had gone an odd shade of green. She knew storms back east, summer thunder, gentle rain, but this was different. The air felt wrong, electric and heavy, like it was waiting for a fight. Inside, she found Mrs. Talbot securing the kitchen windows. You feel that? Clara asked. Storm's coming, the older woman said. A real one. Sand and wind. Maybe worse. Clara moved to the back porch and saw Gideon near the corral, checking ropes and calling orders. Ranch hands moved quick, rounding up animals, stowing tools, batting down whatever could fly loose. Clara scanned the open field. Where's Elias? She asked, heart already tightening. Gideon's face shifted, a flicker of frustration under. Control rode out this morning, said he spotted that black stallion in the North Draw yesterday. Clara swallowed. In this? He thinks he's faster than the weather, Gideon said, grabbing a lasso. He's not. She didn't ask if Gideon was going after him. She could see it in the way his jaw set. Marisol appeared at the edge of the yard, her shawl whipping in the rising wind. She didn't come closer, just called out, that storm's got teeth in it, Gideon. I know. He called back. Don't go alone. He gave a short nod, then turned to Clara. Stay inside. Help Nora. We'll be back before dark. Sure, he looked at her. Not long, but long enough to mean something. I always come back. Then he rode off, his coat flapping behind him like a banner. The first gust of sand hit the house an hour later. Clara and Mrs. Talbot moved like a practiced pair, tying shut cupboards, covering the stove, stuffing rags at the door cracks. The kitchen dimmed as the dust swallowed the light. Clara tried to focus, chopping carrots, checking biscuits, but her mind drifted to the storm, and to Gideon riding straight into it. Sit, Mrs. Talbot said, placing a mug of tea in front of her. No point pacing a groove in my floor. Clara sat. The steam curled from the cup. She didn't drink it. He's gone after Elias, she said quietly. Mrs. Talbot didn't pretend not to know. Elias is reckless, always has been. Gideon's been chasing after him his whole life. Clara nodded. Aaliyah said Gideon gave up a scholarship once. Stayed to raise him. That's true, the older woman said. Gideon could have been a lawyer or doctor if he'd gone, but Elias was barely 9. Their parents died in a wagon accident, and Gideon was already more man than most 20-year-olds I've met. He stayed, built this place from nothing. Clara looked out the window where sand scoured the yard like 1,000 invisible knives. That kind of love. It costs something, she murmured. Mrs. Talbot gave a rare, soft look. It does. I think he's just now learning how to want something for himself again. Clara looked at her. You mean me? Don't waste that man's courage, girl. You're the first thing he's looked at like it might belong to him. Not out of duty, but choice. Outside, the wind screamed like a train whistle. The house shuddered. By dusk, the ranch hands trickled in, faces coated in red dust, voices low. But no sign of the brothers. Clara stood by the window, her fingers clenched around the windowsill. You should rest, Mrs. Talbot said gently. I'll wait a while longer, Clara whispered. She sat by the cold stove, the tea long gone cold, and watched the night settle in around them. The storm didn't let up. It just changed rhythm now and then, roaring, then going quiet as if catching its breath. Hours passed. The men retired to the bunkhouse. Mrs. Talbot brought Clara a blanket and didn't argue further. The oil lamp flickered. Clara fought sleep, her ears tuned to the world outside. Then hoofbeats. She bolted upright and rushed to the porch, pushing open the door with effort. The wind bit at her face. Her eyes scanned the dark. There a horse stumbling toward the house, a figure slumped in the saddle. Clara ran out barefoot, mud sucking at her heels. Gideon, he was soaked with sweat and dust, one arm around Elias's unconscious form. Blood darkened Elias's shirt and Gideon's own sleeve. His face was drawn, hollowed by worry and exhaustion. Help! Clara screamed. We need help. Ranch hands poured from the bunkhouse. They lifted Elias down gently, murmuring about his leg, the angle of it. The blood on his temple found him in the ravine, Gideon said, voice cracked from wind and grit. Horse must have spooked. He was thrown, landed bad. They carried Elias inside, laying him on the dining table. Mrs. Talbot cleared space and shouted orders. Clara grabbed water, cloth, whiskey. She didn't think she moved. They worked as a team, setting Elias's broken leg with makeshift splints, cleaning the gash on his forehead, staunching the bleeding. Elias moaned but didn't wake. When the doctor finally arrived the next day, after the worst had passed, he confirmed the damage. Concussion, broken leg, fractured rib. Time and luck would decide the rest. By nightfall, Elias was settled in the upstairs bedroom. Gideon hadn't left his side. He sat beside the bed, one hand resting on his brother's shoulder. Head bowed, Clara came in quietly, holding a fresh cup of coffee. She touched his arm gently. You need dry clothes. You're soaked through. He didn't look at her, just whispered, I almost didn't find him. But you did, she said, voice soft. You did. His jaw clenched. I knew the storm was coming. I should have stopped him. You're not responsible for every bad choice he makes. Raised him. I made this place to protect him. And I still almost lost him. Clara sat beside him. You brought him home? He looked at her then. His eyes were bloodshot, but not just from the wind. Thank you, he said, for helping. You didn't do much. You were here. That matters. Their eyes held for a long moment. Then Gideon looked away. I should sit with him, in case. I'll take a turn, she said. You need rest, too. He hesitated. Then slowly he nodded and rose to his feet. When he left, Clara settled into the chair beside the bed. Elisa's breathing was shallow but steady. She looked at the unconscious man. Thought about what Gideon had risked to bring him back. I thought about what love looked like when it was carved from the bone, not spoken, but done. She reached for the worn book of poetry Gideon had once placed in her hands and began to read aloud. Her voice a steady balm against the rising wind. As blood darkened the dust on Gideon's shirt, Clara realized this was no longer just a job. It was a vigil. The sound of the ticking clock was the only thing keeping Clara awake. It was nearing 4 a.m. The fire in the bedroom hearth had burned low, casting long, soft shadows across the wooden floor. Elias lay motionless in the bed, his leg wrapped, elevated, his forehead beaded with a light sweat. His breathing had steadied since yesterday. No longer shallow, but deep and even, like someone drifting through a long, hard dream. Clara sat beside him in a straight-back chair that Gideon had padded with folded blankets. She sipped weak coffee, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep. Her hands ached from wringing cloth, carrying trays, changing linens. But none of that mattered. The vigil wasn't over. She glanced at the small book in her lap, the same one Gideon had given her 2 nights ago, its pages slightly warped from the storm, the edges softened by time. She hadn't dared ask why he gave it to her. Maybe he didn't know himself. He just understood that sometimes words fill silences better than people can, she read aloud. It's barely more than a whisper. ... And still, we keep watch, not for the end, but for the breath, the smallest proof that love is not wasted, only waiting. The floor creaked behind her. She turned and saw Gideon leaning against the doorframe, hair damp from the wash basin, sleeves rolled up, boots left outside. He looked less like a rancher and more like a man undone by days without sleep. You should rest, she said softly. He stepped inside, voice just as low. I should say the same. I will soon. He's stable. Gideon sat down across the room, elbows on his knees, fingers laced tight. I'm no good with waiting. That's all this is, she replied. Waiting for someone to come back to us? He looked at her then, really looked tired eyes, sharp with something unspoken. He's the only family I've got, he said. But that doesn't mean I've always known what to do with him. Clara closed the book. To get everything right, to love someone, silence stretched between them. Not cold, not awkward, just full. He stood, moved toward the bed, and laid a hand on Elias's shoulder, gentle, firm. Clara watched his fingers tremble ever so slightly. Made a stool, she said suddenly. Gideon turned. What? She gestured to the small wooden stool near the fireplace. Carved, sanded, simple. You made that, didn't you? It wasn't here before. He glanced at it. We're shifting your weight, standing too long near the hearth yesterday. Figured you could use something steadier than a crate. Her breath caught, not because of the gesture, but because of the ease with which he said it. Like caring for her had slipped into his life without ceremony. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. I'll take the next watch. Clara stood reluctantly surrendering the chair. As she brushed past him, his hand came to rest briefly on her arm. Not possessive. Not unsure. Just present. I'll wake you if anything changes, he said. She paused at the door. Wake me anyway. The next day passed in a strange rhythm, like the ranch had shifted into a new orbit. The men worked quieter. Marisol stopped by with fresh herbs and a silent nod. Mrs. Talbot moved like clockwork. And Clara kept to the upstairs room, taking shifts with Gideon, sometimes speaking. It's more often just being there. In the late afternoon, she brought Gideon coffee. He took it without looking at her. Eyes fixed on Elias. I used to think if I built enough fences, barns, a future, I could hold everything in place. He said quietly, keep him safe. Keep me busy enough not to miss anything. Clara didn't interrupt. But life doesn't care what you build. It still gets in. She sat beside him, their arms not touching, but close enough she could feel the heat off his skin. Maybe it's not about keeping things out. Maybe it's about letting someone stand inside it with you. He turned to her. And what if you do, and they leave anyway? Clara's throat tightened. Then at least you didn't spend your life building a world no one else ever got to touch. His hand twitched like he might reach for hers, but instead he stood and crossed the room. Looking out the window at the sunburnt horizon. I've spent years keeping people at arm's length, he said. Didn't think I had the right to ask for more than what was necessary. Clara rose too, but slower. Her limp more pronounced after a long shift. She hated how noticeable it was in moments like this. Moments. She felt strong in every other way. He turned, as if sensing her discomfort. But again, there was no pity in his eyes. Only awareness. You don't have to say anything, she murmured. I know. He stepped closer. But I want to. Before he could, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Talbot. He's stirring. They turned to see Elias shifting under the blanket, brow furrowing, lips twitching in a half-formed grimace. Gideon rushed to his side. "Elias, can you hear me?" Elias blinked, groaned, then coughed. "Why is the room spinning like a poker table?" Gideon let out a sound that was half laugh, half breath of relief. "You idiot," Clara smiled, brushing a hand across her face to hide the tears threatening. Mrs. Talbot stepped back. "He's back, but not the same." In the days that followed, Ilias's body healed slowly, and his temperament changed. He didn't joke as much. He watched people more than he talked to them, especially Clara and Gideon. One morning, while Clara helped him eat broth, he studied her quietly. "You care about him, don't you?" Elias asked. Clara froze. "Gideon?" He smiled faintly. "I meant the stable boy. But sure, let's talk about my brother." She shook her head, but didn't deny it. "He cares about you too. Not that he'd say it. He'd rather carve a chair for you than speak it out loud." Clara looked down. "I don't know what I am to him." "Not yet," Elias sighed. "He doesn't let people in easy. You're already inside. He just doesn't know how to live with that yet." Clara nodded. "I've lived a long time waiting for someone to see past the limp. I'm not sure I know what to do with someone who sees all of me." Later that night, Gideon returned from the barn with a bundle of wildflowers, scruffy, uneven, clearly picked in haste. He placed them in a jar on the windowsill and said nothing. Clara didn't say anything either, but she let her fingers linger on the jar longer than she needed to. When his fingers brushed in the lamplight, Clara wondered which would hurt more, being seen or being misunderstood. Elias' heart was back on his feet by the third week, at least in body. He leaned heavy on a carved walking stick and cursed under his breath when the stairs creaked too loud under his weight. But he was moving and restless. The kind of restless that meant trouble if no one gave it direction. Clara noticed it first in the way. He rearranged his food on the plate more than he ate it. Then, in the long silences at breakfast, his eyes scanning Gideon across the table with something like guilt. Maybe something else too, gratitude he didn't know how to wear without it itching. "You always this quiet when you're healing?" she asked one morning, sliding his plate in front of him. Elias looked up, gave her a crooked smile. "Only when I don't know where to put my mouth." Clara arched a brow. "I've seen no sign of that so far," he chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Fair." Gideon had already ridden out before sunup. Cattle had broken through a fence line near the ridge. Clara found herself watching the door longer than she meant to after he left, which didn't go unnoticed. "He's always gone before the house wakes," Elias said. "It's his land. It's his excuse," Elias replied, then winced slightly and shifted in his chair. "Sorry, that sounded sharper than I meant." Clara poured coffee into his mug, careful not to meet his gaze. "You don't have to explain him to me." "Maybe not." He took the mug. "But someone should explain him to himself." She looked at him then. Elias took a sip and leaned back. "He doesn't open easy. Always carried the whole damn world on his back, like it was his cross to bear." "You make it sound like a weakness," Elias said, serious now. "It's not weakness. It's distance. He builds these fences inside himself and just hopes the right people know how to climb." Clara leaned against the sink, arms crossed. "And you? You climb?" "I fell in," he said with a grin, then softened. "Truth is, he raised me like a father. But that doesn't mean he let me close. Not really. Not in the ways that matter." She studied him. "You're worried for him." "Am. Not about the ranch. He can run this place in his sleep. But he's not built to live alone forever. And for the first time in, hell, maybe ever, I think he's wanting something he doesn't know how to ask for." Clara turned away, trying to keep her face neutral. "That's between him and himself." Elias stood slower than usual and hobbled over to the porch. "Is it?" She followed him out, letting the spring air touch her face. The desert was starting to bloom. Tiny pops of color breaking through the dust, life insisting on itself. He looked out across the open land, then back at her. "He watches you, you know? Not just your limp. Not just the way you hold things with your left hand like you're ready to defend yourself. He sees you, Clara, and it scares the hell out of him. Her breath hitched, just for a moment. I've had enough men look at me and see what they expect, she said. I'm not sure I'd recognize being seen for real if it were happening. Elias turned to her fully. Then I'm telling you, it is. They stood in silence, only the wind passing between them. He won't say the words, Elias continued. Not yet. But if you're waiting for him to spell it out plain, you'll be waiting until your hair turns white.
Oh.
You talk like you're 90. Feels like it with this leg. He grinned, then grew quiet again. Listen, you've been good to him. You didn't just help, you stayed. And that means more to him than you probably know. But if you're going to love a man like Gideon Hart, you need to be ready to tell the truth. Your truth. Clara felt something in her chest crack a little. Not pain, just pressure she'd been ignoring. What if I'm not sure what that truth is yet? Then you'd better start digging, Elias said, before he rides too far ahead to hear you. That afternoon, Clara worked alone in the kitchen, kneading bread while her mind spun faster than her hands. The house was quiet again, but not heavy. Not anymore. It felt like something alive now. Something waiting. She remembered Marisol's words weeks ago. This land doesn't give things easy, especially not to women. Maybe that was why she hadn't said anything to Gideon yet, because it wasn't just about being seen. It was about what she might owe in return for being loved, for being known. And that was something she hadn't dared before? Not since the fire. Not since the limp she pulled the bread from the oven just as the sun began to dip. Gideon rode back not long after, shirt damp with sweat, boots coated in red dirt. She met him on the porch without thinking. Handing him a glass of water before he even asked, he took it. Their fingers brushing. Thanks, he said. Voice lower than usual. You look half-wrecked, she replied. Fence held. But barely. Clara looked at the horizon. You always ride out alone? I trust my hands, but there are things I need to see for myself, even when others would help you. He glanced sideways at her. Not everyone stays. I'm not everyone. No, he said, slow and sure. You're not. She stepped closer, heart hammering. You gave me that book. The poems? Why? He looked away for a beat. You seemed like someone who'd understand them. Why me? He didn't answer right away. Then, because you carry silence the same way I do. That stopped her. Dead in her tracks? Gideon finally turned, eyes meeting hers. But maybe we don't have to anymore. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Clara took a step back, not out of fear, but to breathe. I'll be on the porch after dinner, she said, voice shaking just a little. If you decide you want to talk about what we're not saying. And she walked away that night. She sat under the stars with a worn blanket around her shoulders, the desert wind warm against her skin. She listened to the creak of the old swing, the howl of a coyote far off. The porch light burned low. She waited. Gideon came out without a word, sat beside her, not touching. Just close. I've never been good with easy things, he said after a long silence. This isn't easy. No, he agreed. But it feels right. And that scares me more than I want to admit. Clara turned toward him. You're allowed to be scared, Gideon. You're not made of stone. He looked at her then. Not like a man watching the world from a distance, but like someone who was ready to step into it. I don't know what this becomes, he said, voice raw. But I know I want to find out. With you. Her hand found his, fingers twining slow. I'm not looking to be rescued, she whispered. I'm not looking to rescue anyone, he replied. Just walk beside her. If she'd let me. And for the first time in a long time, Clara let herself believe in something not born of survival, but of choice. That night, Clara lay awake knowing one thing for certain. If Gideon ever loved her, it would either save them both, or destroy them. The town of Rio Verde dressed itself differently for the harvest celebration. By late afternoon, bunting had been strung between posts along the main road, faded reds and blues fluttering in the warm wind. Long tables appeared where wagons usually parked, already bowing under the weight of pies, stews, and loaves of bread. Someone tuned a fiddle near the church steps, the notes thin at first, then surer, like a voice clearing its throat before speaking. Clara stood at the small mirror in her room at the ranch. Hands resting on the edge of the washstand, Mrs. Talbot's dress hung from her shoulders. Blue and simple, altered just enough to fit. The fabric felt strange against her skin, not stiff, not new, but careful, as if it had been waiting for a reason to be worn again. She pinned her hair back slowly, fingers steady despite the tightness in her chest. She told herself this was just a celebration, a meal, music, nothing more. But her pulse refused to listen. When she stepped onto the porch, Gideon was already waiting. He'd changed out of his work clothes, trading dust and sweat for clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a vest that made his broad shoulders look even more solid. His hair was neatly combed, beard trimmed. He stood by the buggy, one hand resting on the rail, posture stiff in a way that told her he was every bit as uneasy as she was. He looked up when he heard her step. For a moment, he forgot how to breathe. Clara saw it in the way his eyes widened, just slightly, before he caught himself. He straightened, cleared his throat. "You look nice," he said, as if the word were inadequate, but the only one he trusted. She smiled, a little shy. "You clean up well yourself." That earned a small huff of laughter. He offered his hand to help her into the buggy, his grip firm but gentle. Lingering just a second longer than necessary, the ride into town was quiet, but not empty. Gideon pointed out landmarks, the creek that ran dry in summer, the stand of cottonwoods, where kids liked to fish. Clara listened, grateful for the sound of his voice, for the way he seemed more relaxed as the ranch faded behind them. When they arrived, heads turned. It wasn't dramatic. No gasps, just the subtle shift of attention, the quiet counting of steps as Clara walked beside Gideon. Her limp more noticeable after the ride. She kept her chin up, her arm tucked through his, as he guided her through the crowd. Introductions followed. The storekeeper, who'd once looked at her with pity, now smiled wide. A rancher's wife complimented the dress. Someone murmured that Gideon hadn't brought a woman to town in years. Clara felt the weight of it all. The looks. The whispers. But Gideon stayed close, his presence steady, grounding. When her leg ached, he slowed without comment. When she faltered, he adjusted, as if they'd been walking together like this forever. Marisol watched from across the square, a paper cup of cider in her hands. When Clara met her gaze, Marisol lifted her chin in a small nod, something like approval softening her features. The music grew louder as dusk settled in. Lanterns were lit, casting warm pools of light over the packed earth. Couples began to gather near the makeshift dance floor, laughter rising with the fiddles. Clara felt her shoulders tense. Gideon noticed. "You all right?" "Yes," she said too quickly. He studied her face, then glanced toward the dancers. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to." "I know," she said. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, "I've never danced." He looked at her, surprised. "Never?" She shook her head. "Not like that." The music shifted, slower now, a waltz. "The kind that carried you along whether you were ready or not." Gideon took a breath. "Would you like to try?" Her heart lurched. "I can't." "You can," he said gently. "With the right partner?" She laughed, nervous and sharp. "You make it sound easy." "It won't be," he admitted. "But I'll take it slow. We can stop whenever you want." The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Clara looked down at her feet, then back up at him. She thought of every time she'd stepped aside, every invitation she'd declined before it could be spoken. "All right," she said softly. "We can try." He led her onto the dance floor, placing one hand at her waist, the other taking hers. His touch was warm, sure. He positioned himself slightly to her stronger side, his stance solid, protective without being obvious. "Follow me," he murmured. They moved at first. It was awkward. Clara's steps were uneven, her weight shifting unpredictably. Gideon adjusted without comment, his movements subtle, guiding her through a simplified pattern. He counted under his breath, not loud enough for anyone else to hear. 1, 2. 1, 2. Gradually, her shoulders eased. She stopped watching her feet and looked at him instead. The lines of concentration on his face softened as he felt her relax. "You're doing fine," he said. "I don't feel like it. It's because you're thinking too hard." The music swelled, and something clicked. Clara let herself lean into his support, trusting him to carry the rhythm when she couldn't. They moved together, not perfectly, but honestly, around them. The crowd faded. There was only the scrape of boots on dirt, the rise and fall of the fiddle, the steady beat of Gideon's heart beneath her hand. When the song ended, applause broke out, scattered but sincere. Gideon didn't let go right away. His hand stayed at her waist, his thumb pressing lightly, as if to anchor them both in the moment. Clara realized she was smiling. "Thank you," she said, breathless, "for not making me feel foolish." "You weren't," he said. "You were brave." They stepped off the dance floor together. Clara's leg trembled, but it wasn't from pain. It was from the rush of having done something she'd once thought impossible. They found a bench at the edge of town. Beneath a cottonwood tree, the noise of the celebration softened there, becoming a distant hum. Gideon helped her sit, then took the space beside her. Close, but not crowding. For a while, they just listened to the night crickets, laughter, the creak of lanterns in the breeze. "I didn't mean to put you on display," Gideon said finally. "If that's how it felt—" "It didn't," she replied. "It felt like being chosen." He nodded, eyes on the darkening horizon. "I don't do things halfway. If I'm going to walk into town with someone, I want it to mean something." Her chest tightened. "And does it?" He turned to her then, really turned, his face serious in the low light. "It does to me." The words hung between them, fragile and heavy. They walked back toward the celebration slowly. People smiled as they passed, some with curiosity, some with approval. Clara felt taller somehow, steadier, even as her body reminded her of its limits. When the evening wound down and the lanterns began to dim, Gideon helped her back into the buggy. The ride home was quieter than before, charged with a new awareness neither of them knew how to name yet, at the ranch. Elias waited on the porch, leaning on his stick, a grin tugging at his mouth. "About time," he called. "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost." Gideon rolled his eyes. "Go to bed." Elias's gaze flicked to Clara, softened. "You look happy." She surprised herself by answering honestly, "I am." Inside, as Gideon helped her down, their hands lingered again. This time, neither pulled away right away. "Thank you," she said. "For the dance? For seeing me?" He nodded, throat working. "Anytime." She watched him walk toward the barn, his steps lighter than she'd ever seen them. As the music faded, Gideon didn't let go, and Clara knew the real test was still ahead. The night closed in around the ranch, quiet and expectant, as if holding its breath for what would come next. The next morning, Clara woke before the sun, her body still sore from dancing, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years. She dressed slowly, brushing her fingers along the windowsill where dust gathered in the corners, then tied her hair back with the same ribbon she'd worn the night before. The house was quiet. Even the floorboards seemed to creak softer. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Talbot already setting dough to rise. "Well," the older woman said without looking up, "you didn't come home in tears, so I take it the dance went all right?" Clara smiled faintly. "Better than all right?" Mrs. Talbot snorted. "I saw how he looked at you. Like a man who just realized the roof over his head wasn't the only thing worth keeping." Clara busied herself with the coffee pot to hide the blush creeping up her neck. "It's not like that." "Oh, it's exactly like that," Mrs. Talbot said. "You just don't know what to do with it yet." Before Clara could answer, the back door opened and Elias limped in, a bundle of mail under his arm and mischief in his eyes. "Well," he said, tossing a letter on the table, "looks like your fame's spreading." "Town can't stop talking." Clara arched an eyebrow. "About what?" "You and my brother," Elias said, helping himself to a biscuit. "Apparently a slow dance at the harvest celebration is equivalent to a wedding proposal around here." Mrs. Talbot led Clara aside, pouring coffee. "Of course it is." But despite her words, a small part of her liked the idea. not the gossip, but the thought that she and Gideon might be seen together as something more than a fluke. Something real. The quiet didn't last long. Around mid-morning, Gideon rode back from town with a tense look in his eye. He barely tethered his horse before striding inside, boots heavy against the porch. Clara met him near the stove. "Something wrong?" "Laramie's back in town," he said, "and he's been asking questions." Clara froze. "What kind of questions?" "About you," he said. "Your name. Where you came from. What you're doing on the ranch." Her throat went dry. "Did you tell him anything?" "No," Gideon said firmly. "But he's not asking for nothing. That man smells weakness like a bloodhound, and he's got no loyalty to anyone but his own pocket." Clara's mind reeled. She hadn't heard the name Laramie in over a year. Not since she left the mining camp where a man with that same cruel voice had called her girl instead of her name, and threatened to cut her rations in half if she didn't smile more. Gideon watched her face shift. "You know him?" She nodded. "He used to manage a crew near Yuma. Rough man. Drank too much. Took what he wanted. One night She stopped, jaw tightening. Gideon stepped closer gently. "You don't have to say it if you don't want to." "I left after he hurt another girl," Clara said. "I couldn't stay. I didn't want to be next." Rage flared in Gideon's eyes, quick and sharp. But he kept his voice even. "He's not laying a hand on you. It's not here." "Not ever," Clara believed him. But fear was a funny thing. Even when someone else promised safety, it didn't stop the ache that lived in your bones. That afternoon, Clara sat on the porch steps, shelling peas into a tin bowl. Her hands moved out of habit, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Laramie, his sneer, his leering eyes. She hated that a name could still take the breath from her. Elias joined her, settling beside her with a wince. "I heard, of course you did," she said softly. "He's trouble." "I know." Elias leaned back. "You planning to run?" Clara shook her head. "Not this time." "Good," he said. "Because running's not the same as surviving. And you've done enough of both." She didn't speak. But the words settled deep. As evening fell, Gideon called a meeting in the barn, just the hands, Elias, and Clara. He laid it out plain. If Laramie came sniffing around the ranch, they were to say nothing. Clara was family. She belonged here. Clara stood in the shadows, hands clenched at her sides. Later, when the others had gone, Gideon stayed behind, brushing down his horse in slow, rhythmic strokes. Clara stepped into the stall beside him. "I don't want to be protected like some porcelain doll," she said. "I don't see you that way," Gideon replied. "Then what do you see?" He set down the brush, turning to face her. "I see a woman who's survived more than she should have had to. I see someone who walks into storms instead of around them. I see a future I didn't think I'd ever want." She stared at him, her chest tight with unshed tears. "I don't want to hide," she whispered. "Not anymore." "You don't have to." Gideon reached out, his hand brushing hers. This time, she didn't pull away. Their fingers interlaced. Not with desperation, but with intention. Outside, the desert wind picked up again. Carrying the scent of rain, Clara didn't know what tomorrow would bring or what Laramie might try. But she knew this. She wouldn't face it alone. She'd spent years flinching at footsteps, but tonight, for the first time, she leaned toward them. The sun had barely crested the hills when Laramie rode in. He came slow, like he owned the road, dust trailing behind him in lazy spirals. His coat was worn, his hat pulled low, and his eyes, cold and gray, scanned the ranch yard with the smug confidence of a man who thought trouble was a currency he could spend wherever he pleased. Clara stood on the porch when he arrived. Back straight, dress clean, hands steady. She didn't flinch. Gideon stepped out beside her, his shoulders squared, shotgun resting casually across one arm. Not aimed, just present. Laramie dismounted, brushing off his coat like he was about to sit for coffee. "Well," he said, grinning with half a mouth of teeth. "You do clean up nice, Clara." Gideon's jaw tensed. Clara said nothing. Laramie looked around. "Fine piece of land you've got here, Hart. Shame if something happened to it." "Get to the point," Gideon said. "Oh." I will. Laramie reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, held it between two fingers. Seems your little cook here left behind some debts. Signed agreements from Yuma. Room, board, doctor's fees. All unpaid. He handed the paper to Gideon, who barely glanced at it before handing it back. Forged, Gideon said flatly. Laramie shrugged. Maybe, maybe not. But if I take this to the sheriff, it'll cause enough dust to choke your whole operation. Clara finally spoke. You're not here for a debt? Laramie grinned wider. No, sweetheart. I'm here for you. Gideon stepped forward then, the shift in his body dangerous and deliberate. She's not going anywhere with you. Laramie's voice dropped, oily and low. You think you scare me, Hart? I know you're kind. Always playing hero until someone bleeds. Gideon didn't blink. Try me. The air thickened. Clara stepped between them. Her voice was calm, strong. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Laramie. And I'm not running. If you want to take this to court, fine. I'll swear under oath what you did in Yuma, to me, to the others. I'll name every girl who had to stitch herself up in the dark because you didn't think she'd tell. Laramie's smile faltered. You go to the sheriff, Clara continued, and I'll be right behind you with a lawyer, a Bible, and the truth. I laughed. Then, from behind the barn, Elias appeared with two of the ranch hands, both armed, both watching carefully. Laramie looked around. The porch. The barn. The eyes on him. He wasn't in Yuma anymore. He turned back to Clara. You think you've won? She didn't answer. He spat in the dirt, swung back onto his horse, and rode off without another word. The sound of his hoofbeats faded down the road, until all that remained was the soft wind pushing across the fields. No. One spoke for a long time. Then Gideon turned to Clara. You all right? She nodded once. I am now. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. In the days that followed, the ranch returned to its quiet rhythm. Laramie didn't come back. Word got out he'd skipped town after being questioned about some missing funds down south. Clara doubted she'd ever see him again, and if she did, she wouldn't be the one afraid. Elias walked without the stick now, though he still claimed the limp for sympathy when it suited him. He gave Clara her space, but winked every time he caught Gideon watching her like she was the thing he trusted more than thee. Land Mrs. Talbot pretended she hadn't cried the night it was all over, but Clara found her outside the next morning, whispering thanks to the wind. One afternoon, Gideon brought Clara a ring. Simple, silver, no diamond. Just a plain band shaped like the moon sliver that had hung above them the night they first danced. He didn't get down on one knee. He just said, You don't have to say yes, but if you do, I'll build us a porch big enough to grow old on. She said yes. Not because she needed saving, but because she didn't want to live her life behind closed doors anymore. Years later, people in Rio Verde still talked about the limping girl who walked straight into the heart of a quiet man and changed everything. They said she brought color to the house, books to the shelves, and music to the kitchen. They said Gideon smiled more after she arrived, and Elias drank a little less. But what they didn't say, what only the two of them knew, was that healing wasn't something that came in grand gestures. It came in making bread side by side in shared glances, across a dusty yard, in choosing every day to stay, and in the end, that was the story they built together. Not about being whole, but about being willing to stand, to risk, to love even with the scars. Because some people don't fix you, they just hold your hand while you fix yourself.